Welcome to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 Where we explore topics at the intersection of mental health, wellness, and the challenges we face in life. I'm the producer and your host, Debra Sloss, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Today, we're addressing a deeply personal and widely debated topic, medical aid in dying, or MAID. MAID is a time-tested medical practice that empowers terminally ill, mentally capable adults to request medication they can self-ingest to die peacefully on their own terms. With nearly 21% of the U.S. population being aging baby boomers, this conversation has never been more relevant. By 2030, an estimated 73 million boomers will be 65 or older, making autonomy, dignity, and end-of-life care critical issues in the public and private conversation. While only a small number of individuals ultimately choose MAID, its availability shapes how we approach dying, caregiving, and our healthcare system. Joining us today are three remarkable guests, each offering a unique perspective. Lisa Segnitz, a palliative care doctor who will guide us through the medical and ethical considerations. Kim Stokely, a family member, sharing her lived experience of supporting her sister through this process. And Neil Vargas-Gladen, a chaplain, to discuss the spiritual and emotional dimensions of end-of-life choices. Together, we'll explore the safeguards in place, the mental health implications for all involved, and how this choice impacts conversations around autonomy, compassion, and dignity in dying. Let me tell you more about our guests. Lisa Segnitz is a board-certified hospice and palliative care physician who works at Palo Alto Medical Foundation's Palliative Care and Support Services program, as well as for Hospice of Santa Cruz County and Dominican Hospital. She enjoys supporting patients and families with serious illness in navigating all options for end-of-life care, and has participated as a prescriber for California's End-of-Life Option Act since it passed in 2016. Neil Vargas-Gladen has been the supervising chaplain for Hospice of Santa Cruz County since 2017, bringing extensive experience in hospice and spiritual care. He previously served as a chaplain for Hospice of the Valley and Los Gatos Meadows and began his career as a parish minister in the Lutheran and Ananda churches. Neil holds a Master of Divinity, completed graduate studies in psychology, and trained at Stanford University's hospital through a clinical pastoral education residency. He has supported patients and families through the End-of-Life Option Act, including being present for some of these patients at the time of their passing. And finally, with us is Kim Stokely, a resident of Whidbey Island, Washington, where she enjoys a life centered around family, art, and gardening. Kim has 2 grown children, 4 grandchildren, and a deeply personal connection to our topic. Her younger sister, Tori, who lived with ALS for 2.5 years, chose to end her life through medical aid in dying. Kim supported her sister through this journey and is here to share her experiences in order to help others navigating similar circumstances with their loved ones. Welcome to State of Mind, Dr. Segnitz, Neil, and Kim.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much.
Well, first, I'd like to thank our guest today, Dr. Lisa Segnitz, for bringing this important topic to our attention. Dr. Segnitz's husband, Dr. Carl Segnitz, also a palliative care physician, was a guest on a previous episode, episode 68, on caring for aging and dying parents. And I'm delighted to now welcome Dr. Lisa Segnitz to our program. When she reached out with the idea for today's discussion, I embraced it wholeheartedly. As an aging baby boomer myself, end-of-life planning has become a significant and necessary part of conversations within my social circles. This topic's also personal for me as it resonates with the recent experience of my dear friend who chose medical aid in dying as her health declined due to ALS. Her sister Kim is joining us as a guest today to share her perspective. To start our discussion, Dr. Segnitz, would you explain what medical aid in dying MAID entails and how's it regulated here in California?
Certainly. And thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about this topic. So, medical aid in dying is, I first wanted to just clarify terms a little bit. The current term that we're using is medical aid in dying, but some people have also referred to it as physician aid in dying. And some people also may have previously heard or used a term physician assisted suicide, which is not the term that we currently use because it's not considered suicide. And also, another term people may have associated with this concept is euthanasia, and that also is not accurate, and we can get into why that is later. So in California, the End of Life Option Act was passed in 2016, and California, I believe, was the seventh state to approve, and I think there's 11 states in which it's legal, and Oregon was the first back in 1997. The End of Life Option Act lays out a pathway for people who may want to participate in a series of steps. And basically, eligibility requires a person being 18 or older and a California resident and having a 6 months or less life expectancy.
So, Dr. Segnitz, can you describe what your role or what the role of the doctor is in the End of Life Option Act here in California? And to your knowledge, does it work similarly in other states that offer medical aid in dying options?
Sure. My role is to assess my patient's eligibility to participate, as I mentioned earlier, the eligibility criteria, and then to help counsel them regarding all of their end of life options, of which medical aid in dying is just one. Then to help guide them through the steps to obtain the prescription, which involves two verbal requests from me spaced out by 48 hours now. It used to be 2 weeks, but that got updated a couple of years ago, as well as a written request and then a visit with a consulting physician who's a second physician. And ultimately, I provide the prescription and support around planning, around taking the medication and expectations about how that process goes. And my understanding that it is quite similar in other states, but each state has slight variations on timing and the steps required.
Now, Kim, you're here to share your experience of supporting your sister through her choice to use medical aid in dying. Can you tell us her story and how she came to make that choice?
I'm going to start from her diagnosis. She lived actually for 3.5 years after she was diagnosed. And she actually had ALS quite a long time, probably before that. But people, I guess, typically live about 2.5 years after diagnosis. And it was really a devastating diagnosis. When we all heard that diagnosis, we all knew enough to know that it basically was telling her she wasn't going to live very long, and that in the time that she had left, there was going to be a lot of suffering. It's just a miserable way to go. And so my sister and I, my older sister and I, immediately went into research of what were all the clinical trials, what were the alternative treatments, what were the possibilities, and it was almost a frantic sort of all three of us, all the sisters were sort of frantic, like looking for answers, even though we were being told there really weren't any, that there were some things that could extend her life by a couple of months. We just went looking, and we found a few things like that acupuncture could help with some of the symptoms and, um, you know, uh, keeping yourself at a certain weight was helpful, things like that. But there was nothing that was going to really extend her life. And then they talked about a feeding tube and going on a respirator later on. And she pretty early decided not to go on the respirator, which could potentially extend her life a long time, but the quality of her life was not going to be what she would want. She would probably be completely unable to move, completely unable to take care of herself, but she would be alive if she was on a respirator and a feeding tube. So she kept the feeding tube idea open, but the respirator, she said no right from the beginning. And she pretty quickly decided to live into her dying instead of living into extending her life. And actually, for all of us, that was kind of a relief because we could relax and support her in her dying and the end of her life, instead of trying to extend her life and having any kind of hope that really wasn't there. So she was a Buddhist teacher, and she taught about death and dying for her whole career. So for 20 years, she had been teaching about death and dying. So it was kind of a perfect thing for her to live into that, her own death. So, sorry about all my tears. One of the things she did
Of
was
course, they
she
make
started,
sense.
yeah, she started um, creating a film on her death called "Only the Mountain Remains." Only the mountain remains, and in that she was describing her thoughts on her dying, and it was a beautiful art film. And I think that process of creating that film was really good for her, because it helped her. That I think creativity is life. We're creating. And so it was very healing. It wasn't healing to her body because her body was dying, but it was healing to her spiritually. And so that was a really wonderful thing. And and she did a lot of writing. I'm going to read one of her poems in a little while. And she also spent a lot of time connecting what she said to the greater cosmos, or to God. She said she was calling it God just because of not knowing a better term. And really, that to her, that was sort of the energy of love and light. And um, so she actually used psychedelics to help her connect more to that greater cosmos and to God. And helped her a lot, actually. It would help calm her and help her realize that there was more to life, more to this universe than her human structure, her human form. So all of those things helped us too, because what was hard for us, I think, was worrying about her. Us, the family and her friends, was worrying about her being. And I think all of us, we were worried about, well, what happens when you die? And the truth is, what we found was, the closer that we got, she had very strong beliefs because of her Buddhist beliefs. But really, what came out was that none of us really know. Nobody truly knows what's going to happen. We believe something, but we don't know. And so to have to live with that for her, for all, and the family and her friends, was just, it's an unusual thing to have to come to terms with. And you have to sort of open your soul to the unknown and the uncertainty of everything.
Can you speak some about her choice, about when she made the choice to choose medical aid in dying? Like, was it early in her process or much later? And how did she come to that?
It was fairly early on. She, the doctors actually talked to her and said, often people at the end of their life with ALS choose medical aid in dying because it's such an awful death. Because basically, it often is that the patient suffocates. And so people, before they get to that point, they either choke to death or they suffocate. And before they get to that point, it's just she was getting pretty close to that. We were surprised that she was continuing to not choke or die from her lack of being able to breathe. Um, so pretty early on, she made the decision she was going to end her life. And and as I said, there was a sort of relief in that we were going to know what was going on, that there was going to be. I feel as though it gave her agency. It gave her a control in this out of control situation. It allowed her to say, okay, I'm going to die, so I'm going to control when I die, and I don't have to suffer. And so we could just support her in that decision. And the legal aspects with ALS make it very easy for her because ALS is so terminal and there's no cure, and everybody agrees with that, that it just was no problem. It just flowed right through. And in Colorado, it just was very easy. Her doctor supported it. Her doctor is the first one who even told her that that was very common.
Can you talk some about what was the impact of her choosing medical aid in dying on you and other family members and maybe even other people in her community? And if there was a range of reactions within your family or loved ones, what were they?
I don't really know of anybody who was not supportive. That may sound odd, but there were people when I was telling people afterwards that that's what had happened, where I could see that they were going to start saying something negative. And what I would do is start talking about her suffering and her courage. That's one of the things that we all learned is that the courage it takes to make that decision, even though she's going to die, that takes incredible courage to say, okay, I'm going to die now. Whew. That was probably the moment that was the most impactful for me was watching her walk to her death the day that she died, to walk to the room that she was going to die in and get in that bed and actually choose to do that. It was so courageous and with such resolve. And so if I talk about that with people, there's something that shifts in people, that it's not weakness or sadness, it's courage that is happening right there. It's amazing courage. So one of the other things is that she created, before she died, a death team. She called it her death team, and it was a group of 8 friends and 1 family member who were on her death team, and they supported her every week. 4 of them got together and supported her for a couple of hours in this decision for 2 years. And then the 8 people, I mean, they were together 6 days before her death for 3 days at a retreat. And the family came and was all with her for 4 days before her death. And then we were all together during her death. And so it was an amazing supportive environment. And that was a learning also. And the space was gorgeous. It was filled with flowers. And I mean, it couldn't have been more beautiful. And her humor was there. She waved goodbye to all of us. you know,
Kim, do you think that your sister was aware of how much relief her decision provided for all of you?
you think so? I think she was very open to talking about all of this. That was her personality. So I think she would even ask.
Just reflecting on your own experience and your own mental health, Kim, how did your sister's decision to choose medical aid in dying impact your mental health, both before, during, and after she completed the dying process?
I don't think any of us wanted her to suffer. I think the scariest thing for all of us was to watch her suffering. At the end, she couldn't swallow. So every time she ate or had to take a pill, she would choke. She had to have the Heimlich maneuver one time at that point because she wasn't wanting to die at that moment. So I think it just helped us all relax instead of being stressed about trying to make it all better. We got to just relax and feel our own sadness instead of trying to keep it at bay somehow.
So it allowed you to process along with her because you all knew what was going to happen.
Right. And we actually could talk about it more because we could start joking about it even because it was real. We knew what was happening. And so we could all just talk about it.
So I want to turn to you, Dr. Segnitz, and just ask, what have you seen about how medical aid in dying intersects with mental health considerations for both patients and their families? You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Debra Sloss, and today we're exploring the complex and deeply personal topic of medical aid in dying. Medical Aid in Dying, or MAID, offers a legal option for terminally ill individuals to choose the timing of their death. Coming up, we'll discuss the mental health implications and ethical and emotional perspectives related to this choice. We'll also hear how it impacts caregivers and loved ones. Joining us are Kim Stokely, who supported her sister through this process, Dr. Lisa Segnitz, a hospice and palliative care physician, and chaplain Neil Vargas-Gladen, who brings years of experience in spiritual care. Let's get back to our interview. So I want to turn to you, Dr. Segnitz, and just ask, what have you seen about how medical aid in dying intersects with mental health considerations for both patients and their families?
Well, first, I'd just like to acknowledge Kim. Thank you so much for sharing that incredibly eloquent story. And you touched on so many of the elements that I think are so important to this whole process. So thank you so much. As far as medical aid in dying and mental health, I think the logistical issue around mental health is specific to, as a prescriber, I'm required to assess if a patient has any mental health considerations that could be affecting their judgment. Because the process is intended to be autonomous, it's incredibly important that anybody who is participating has full medical decision-making capacity, which can sometimes be impacted if the patient themselves has an underlying mental health issue that is poorly controlled. And part of my role is to assess whether the patient needs to have a further assessment by a mental health specialist to confirm whether their judgment is impaired by any underlying mental health issue. That's very rare. In all of the patients that I've worked with, this issue's only come up a handful of times. I think the much greater issue is any family and patient who are going through this process are experiencing appropriate emotions, many of which Kim just alluded to, the appropriate sadness, what we call anticipatory grief process, both for the patient and the family, and that is totally distinct from clinical depression. And so I think that, it's very appropriate for any patient who is thinking about this to go through all kinds of emotions and preparations. And ideally, that patient and family are able to be supported by a team. So I work as part of a palliative care team that involves a social worker and a medical chaplain. And then ultimately, I refer patients to hospice to help with this process when they're eligible and ready. And hospice also has social workers and chaplains like Reverend Neil here.
So one last question. If someone were to have a mental health, pre-existing mental health condition that they are living with and has been managed, bipolar disorder or even like a history of depression, and they are facing a terminal illness and a choice, and making decisions and choices about their dying process, does that exclude them in any way if it can be determined that that's not impacting their decision about their death? Like, are they still eligible for MAID, or does that exclude them in some way?
No, you're right that does not exclude them as long as they are assessed to have medical decision-making capacity that is not impaired by the extent of their mental illness.
Also with us today is hospice chaplain Neil Vargas-Gladen. Neil, can you talk some about how spiritual beliefs influence discussions and decisions around medical aid in dying?
Thanks, Deborah. I'd be happy to. But before I do that, I just want to say how much I appreciate the articulate and heartfelt comments of the other people on here today. Thanks so much, Dr. Segnitz, Kim, Deborah. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you in this conversation. So, spirituality means so many different things within our culture. The term itself is used widely and very differently by people. For some, spirituality is their entire life. There's nothing about their life that isn't involved in their spirituality. For other people, they'd say, oh, I'm somewhat religious or somewhat spiritual, or I'm spiritual but not religious. They use it very differently. Others would say, no, I'm not spiritual, not religious. And all of this to say is that religion and spirituality, in terms of its terminology, is used in very diverse ways across our culture for a wide variety of reasons. So I help people to suss out their identity. Who am I in relation to God? Who am I in relation to the divine? Who am I in relation to my community, my culture? So identity is one of the key things. What is my purpose? What am I supposed to be doing in this life? How we construe meaning. And for most of us, meaning is construed in terms of narrative. What is my story? And how does my story interweave with other people's story, with the stories out of the tradition, with the story of the life of God intertwined with my life? So all this to say, it's not very tidy. It's kind of messy, and that's perfectly fine. We're not going to come up with some nifty generalizations to sort of pull this all together in a bound up package. It's not going to work that way. But it is one of the things that both Dr. Segnitz alluded to it and Kim. A key difference here between medical aid in dying and suicide is observed in how it affects the family. Suicide knocks people for a loop. It's something some people never get over. But medical aid in dying, if it's done in a good way, as you're talking about here, Kim, it draws people together. So your story, Kim, about how we were able to come together as a community for a couple of years and how we were able to laugh and joke, and this is who we are in relation to what's happening here. Now that is really helpful in illustrating what's possible here.
So, can you talk some about how you support individuals and families that are grappling with mental health challenges surrounding end of life choices? So, people sometimes feel distressed around taking that choice into one's own hands. And so
Yeah,
I'm wondering, how do you work with people around that?
well, when I'm working with a patient or someone who's doing that, I'm going to ask questions that help them to articulate their own thought or their own feeling on that matter. We're a somewhat of an individualistic culture, too much so, I think. I honestly think we outsource our sanity by being in good conversation with helpful people. I think if we fail to do that when we're in big decisions, we're less likely to make good decisions. And this opportunity not only to have the conversation, but have the conversation with someone who's a good listener and who's calm. I don't try to push it one way or the other. I do the very best I can to be neutral and to follow their own process. What's happening with them, do the classic kinds of slowing the conversation down, and then we just move forward.
As a chaplain, do you strictly work with the individual to encourage them to have the conversation, or do you sometimes invite families in to help them have that conversation in a supported environment?
All of the above. So sometimes people want to have an individual conversation. That's what we do. Sometimes people want to have a conversation with family. Sometimes family members want to have conversation with me.
And is that typical for other hospice chaplains?
Yes, that's the normative approach for chaplains.
I would just add in palliative care and hospice work, I think that's across the board. We try really hard to work not just with patients, but with their loved ones, their support system, whether that's family or friends. Everyone is invited, and the conversations are the best when we are able to involve all the main players.
Well, Dr. Segnitz, I also want to ask you, what are some of the ethical challenges or dilemmas you face in assisting with medical aid in dying?
I really appreciated, Neil, that you used the word messy. I think that, as with all things of being human, there's so many different ways to approach any given problem, and every situation is unique and different. Some of the most challenging situations that I've encountered have been, one example is what you were just discussing, if family members are not all on the same page. Another is in the situation we were discussing earlier, if there are underlying mental health issues and questions about eligibility. I also find it challenging if I am working with a patient who does have a life-limiting illness but is not yet eligible, but is feeling ready and wanting to pursue medical aid in dying. But legally, I can't attest that they're truly in the 6-month window. The other category is people who I am concerned that they're looking at pursuing medical aid in dying because they're suffering with symptoms that aren't managed and that it feels more of physical suffering before they're necessarily emotionally or spiritually ready to be at the end of their life. And so I feel like one of my main roles is trying to manage symptoms and help them feel like this can be a slowed down process. I never want anyone to feel like they need to choose this route because they can't be comfortable.
I understand that the research shows that it's most often white, college educated males in their 70s who actually access MAID. What are the disparities in access to medical aid and dying services that you've seen, and what can be done to address those disparities, Dr. Segnitz?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly, just because the law is in place and physicians are able to prescribe doesn't mean that they're comfortable or willing to prescribe. So, not all physicians participate. It tends to be more hospice and palliative providers who are prescribers, but also primary care providers are, but many are not participating. So, sometimes if a patient is interested, it can be a challenge to find a doc that's willing to work with them and be their prescriber. I was thinking about ways to address this, and I think some of it is just education. I am always happy to mentor anybody who's interested in becoming a prescriber, just in getting through the steps, because it can feel overwhelming, but really it's fairly straightforward. It's just a lot of logistics. I think that we're doing a better job of educating new physicians. I'm getting to work now with a brand new family medicine residency program here in Santa Cruz, and we're trying to educate new family doctors on how to become prescribers so that we can eliminate that barrier. As far as obtaining the medications themselves, the prescription is a compound of multiple high dose medications, and pharmacies that we work with the most are charging like $700 for the medication, and it's an out of pocket expense that's not covered by Medicare. The exception is that Medi-Cal actually is covering the prescription through specific pharmacies. So we have been able to help Medi-Cal patients get access, but also the pharmacies that we work with sometimes are willing to work on a sliding scale. But certainly, it tends to be a specific demographic that has access. And I think part of that is not just awareness, but it's also these logistical hurdles.
Kim, how did you reconcile any personal or societal stigma that arose or that you found associated with medical aid in dying and your sister's choice to use it?
Mostly, I ignored it.
That's good advice.
I decided that they just had their own opinion and that they weren't experiencing it. And that if they were experiencing it themselves, they would realize the good reasons for it, how it shifted the conversation and the ability to grieve together, the courage that it took for the person to decide that it's not an easy decision, that it took a lot of thought and contemplation. There was good reason for it. And so if I felt somebody going there, I just didn't let it go there. I just would take them to a different place in the conversation. And so I didn't get a lot of that.
And when you reflect on it, what role do you think your family dynamics or cultural background play in terms of your sister's choice and this whole journey for your family?
I think that there was an openness in my family to talking about grief, about dying. My mother and my father had both already died, and so we had participated in their deaths, and they were open about us participating in their death. And so I think that that was really important, that we didn't run away from that conversation. And I would also say that family wise, what I had to learn was that we still stay the messiness of our family, even though somebody's dying. And you kind of want that messiness to go away and all the relationships to be perfect because somebody's dying, right? That's more important than any of that mess. But in reality, all that mess stays there right up to the end. And so even for me with the mess, even the some of the messiness between my sister Tori who died and I wanted her to change and I wanted her to address some of these challenges that she had before she died. I wanted her karma to be cleaned up, right? Because that's what she believed. And so that was really hard for me to let go of that. And so that's one of my learnings is I think to not try to fix her before she died, to just let her be Tori and not try to make her anybody else and not try to make the family anybody else because we're the family that we are.
Would you have any advice that you'd give to others who may find themselves in a position to support a loved one who's considering medical aid in dying?
Well, I think that Neil said something earlier, and that is to just listen to them. That if that's what they're choosing, then that's what they're choosing. That's okay to not try to hang on to them living a few days longer or a few months longer or whatever it is, that this is not an easy choice and that it's the right choice for them. And the other thing is to not try to fix them. That, we go into this struggle of whether it's healing them physically or emotionally or spiritually, that they're just who they are and that this is their choice.
Dr. Segnitz, as a medical doctor, do you play a role in supporting families emotionally and psychologically in the MAID process? And if so, what does that look like?
I certainly try to. My goal is to help counsel along the way so that people understand what their diagnosis is, what their prognosis is, help them collect all the information they're hearing from all of their providers and sift through it and understand how it really relates to them as an individual, and ultimately make choices that are specific to them rather than one size fits all medicine. So I think just having the forum that is open to talk about options, which include medical aid in dying. Sometimes people bring it up, sometimes I will bring it up in case they're not aware of it, and then just work through what those logistics look like. But I also, as I mentioned before, really work within the context of a larger team. So I try to bring in our social worker or chaplain, and then refer to hospice, whose team takes over at some point.
So, Dr. Segnitz, if folks are not getting or finding support from their doctor, where else can they go to find that?
So, unfortunately, I don't have a single answer for that. It really depends on the system in which you get your health care. Ideally, people would have access to palliative care programs either through um, their health network, like at Sutter, and Sutter has a referral system that can help connect patients who are looking for a prescribing doc. Um, but there are palliative care programs through many other sources now. I know Hospice of Santa Cruz County has a palliative program. Hospices also often have a list of prescribing providers that they're able to connect patients with. I also am aware that there's some faith-based organizations that have communities that gathered for education and support. And I think that there's so much interest now in this topic that a lot of times it's word of mouth, but certainly asking through all of the communities that people are involved in, hopefully they're able to find access.
And Neil, how have you seen caregivers find peace and meaning in supporting the medical aid and dying choice for their loved one?
I think as the caregivers see the patient, their loved one, find peace and find meaning, that helps them to do that. People come on hospice and they'll say, okay, I've got 6 months left to live. I'd like to know the day and the hour. Could you tell me that, please? And no, the best physician on the planet normally cannot do that. But in this case, you can say, okay, on Friday at 3 o'clock, we'll gather the crew, and that's when it's going to happen. It allows people to be surrounded by their loved ones and the actual setting of the time for some people. Not everybody, but for some people, that's helpful.
I'd like to add to that, when my sister set the date for her death, that was actually one of the most challenging parts of things.
I'm your host, Debra Sloss, and you're tuned to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. Today, we're exploring medical aid in dying, or MAID, and its impacts on individuals, families, and communities. Coming up, we'll share valuable resources and offer insights to support those navigating serious illness and end-of-life decisions. Joining us are Kim Stokely, Dr. Lisa Segnitz, and chaplain Neil Vargas-Gladen, who bring a wealth of personal stories and professional expertise to this conversation. Every State of Mind episode has a resource list, and any we talk about today are included in the show notes for this episode at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Now, let's get back to our interview.
When my sister set the date for her death, that was actually one of the most challenging parts of things, because to prepare ourselves, the family to prepare for that date was really, there's a lot involved with that, of the anticipatory grief, the preparing for the actual details of somebody dying, taking care of her affairs and getting all of her bank account numbers, just all of those things. And then all of the ceremonies that were going to happen around her death, and getting plane tickets to go to her death, and just all of the things that we this huge group of people was going to congregate around her. And then she changed the date, and that was really, really hard. You would think it would make us happy that it extended it, but it was so hard because we had gotten prepared emotionally for this death. And so that setting that date, that would be one piece of advice I would have, is once you set it, if you can be sure that it's the date, that's really important for the family. And of course we all understood and we all kind of went with it. But boy, we planned a Thanksgiving dinner after her date of her death, and so that we could all be together and support each other. And then she didn't die, and she was mad that we didn't tell her about Thanksgiving dinner. And so it was just a mind bender, So that was a hard one.
I'm not sure if we've discussed it yet. Sometimes people will go through the whole process of getting the medication prescribed. They have the script, they have the prescription, and they don't even go get the medication. Or they'll get the medication in the house and never use it. I think at least part of what's going on in many of those cases is it's the issue of autonomy. Okay, I'm in charge here. I can do this or not. It's up to me. So that's a significant portion of the people who engage in this process, is people who get the prescription or the meds and never actually use them.
I know that receiving of the medicine is a big moment for people, and my sister wrote a poem about it, and I wanted to share it. It's called Go to God Medicine. The courier delivered the Go to God medicine today. He handed it to me as if it was a box of new Tupperware. Little did he know. I held the deadly brew, born from poppies and the Brazilian malunga tree, and some synthetic that has more letters than a word should be allowed to have. I asked it what secrets, freedoms, love, unity, challenges, and terrors it had for me. If it had feet, I would have kissed them. But since it did not, I put my hands in prayer position and bowed deeply in awed respect.
Beautiful.
So that just even getting that medicine is a big, big deal,
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's
Love
incredible.
that poem.
Thank you
I love
so
that
much for
poem.
sharing. That's so beautiful.
Kim, I'm wondering if you could talk some about the actual dying process and how that was for you and maybe for other family members.
It was very important for Tori to, she felt as though she might lose her resolve if she made eye contact with her family members. So she asked the family to sit behind her. And her death team sat flanking her so she could make eye contact with them, and they were there to support her in dying. And so the family being like 25 people sat behind her. And she had told us, she had been very clear, she had explained what was going to happen in the sense of her. And she said, I will let everybody know when I'm ready. And until I'm ready, we're going to sit and meditate, or there will be singing and music. And she had put together a playlist for this whole part. and so we had been told that once she took the medicine, it was going to take typically 10 minutes for her to die, up to 2.5 hours. And that there was an average, and I don't even remember what that was, but that it could be as quick as even 7 minutes. And so we waited until, and we were all meditating until she said, okay, I am ready. And that was quite a moment. And my daughter, who's a doctor, is the one who actually medically assisted her in setting up the medical equipment for giving her the medicine. And that was quite intense to just get it all hooked up. We're hooking things up for her to die. And then she started, she did the plunger, and she had to do it herself. And she plunged this plunger in, and it was hard because she was so weak. So she was shaking, and there was worry, was that going to work? But it all worked. And then she quickly relaxed and fell asleep. And she had had such a hard time breathing. And I don't know what happened, but everything relaxed, and suddenly she could breathe. And everybody in the room was just like, oh, that's so wonderful. She's breathing. And then it took her 7 hours to die. So we just all meditated and listened to her breathing for 7 hours. And, you know, just we were sort of afraid at one point that maybe she wasn't going to die. And so we had to get information on that from the hospice people who were in the house. They're not in the room where she was dying, but in the house. And we went and asked, is she going to actually die? And they said, no, don't worry, she's dying. And it's just taking her a long time. The amazing thing is that her breathing just slowed. It didn't go longer between breaths, but it just got shallower and shallower and shallower and shallower and stopped. And it just was a beautiful and very peaceful process. It became more and more peaceful. It was really quite beautiful in a funny sort of way.
The alternative to swallowing the medication orally is using a rectal catheter and using a syringe, and where the patient depresses the plunger to administer the medication rectally. Medications are never given intravenously or intramuscularly, and they're always administered by the patient themselves.
I'm going to take a little right turn now because unfortunately the time goes way too fast. And I've enjoyed this conversation so much with all of you and wish we could go on and on. But I'm going to turn now to resources. And I want to ask Dr. Segnitz, are there resources that you'd want to share with those who might be facing a terminal illness? Maybe they're considering medical aid in dying, or resources for their family or loved ones?
Certainly. There are several websites that I would recommend that have very robust information. The Coalition for Compassionate Care of California is one of them, and they have a specific section on medical aid in dying. And they also have a section on advanced care planning, ACP, which refers to the process of establishing an advanced healthcare directive and also potentially a POLST form. POLST is spelled POLST, and that stands for Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. And that is a way to specify one's wishes in case of emergency for specific types of medical care like resuscitation and artificial nutrition. In addition to that site, there's a California Pulse website that has that information directly. And then there's Compassion and Choices and the Final Exit Network, other organizations that have terrific resources. And if there are providers who are interested in finding more information about being a prescriber or how to support patients through the process, there's an academy, the American Clinicians Academy on Medical Aid and Dying, acamaid.org.
Kim, what specific resources have you found to be helpful as you navigated the medical aid and dying process with your sister?
So one of the things that was very helpful was the 5 Wishes document, and going over that with her in detail. She did it. We went over it like 3 different times right away. And when she found out she had ALS, and then as it got closer and closer to death, we went more and more in depth into that. And there were more details of how she really wanted all of the different things in the 5 Wishes. And there you can find that at 5wishes.org. Then the other thing is that we spent time talking to her about the ceremonies and celebrations that she wanted for her life. And so that's an amazing thing to be able to plan that in advance with her. What kind of music did she want? What did she want with her body? And what did she want at the ceremony for spreading her ashes and those sorts of things. And then the other thing is I don't know where to get this exactly, but I've seen it. But all of the details that you have to get from a person when they're going to die. And if you know they're going to die, to get their bank account information, make sure somebody has power of attorney, who's going to get their computer and their phone, and all of those details. That sounds silly, but that became very helpful to have all that information.
Neil, what resources have you found to be helpful for those facing the end of their own lives or possibly contemplating medical aid and dying, and maybe resources for their family?
One thing, and I think I've alluded to it already, I would encourage people to develop a network of folks that they can talk about difficult things with and get that done early. Is it your local clergy, or have you got a therapist or someone else? Get that in place early rather than late in the process. So that would be my biggest advice as far as resources, is not just the books and internet and stuff, but find someone with whom you can have that kind of a conversation. From my point of view, in spiritual care, that's really, really crucial.
That's great advice. Thank you. So, Neil, from your perspective as a chaplain guiding individuals and families through the spiritual and emotional dimensions of end of life decisions, what do you hope listeners will understand about the intersection of medical aid and dying and mental health?
I think crucial is the idea that the end of life, the fact that we die, is part of the natural cycle. There is a resistance to the whole idea of dying. If we just pretend it isn't there, maybe it'll go away, is implicit in our culture. There's books written about the denial of death, Ernst Becker's book and others. I think it's okay, rather than pretending it's not going to happen or fighting against it somehow, to say, okay, this is inevitable. It's what's happening now. And so to face it, embrace it, and open your heart to the people and to the divine in that time.
Kim, as someone who's experienced the profound journey of supporting your sister through medical aid and dying, what insights or lessons do you hope listeners will take away from this conversation, especially about the mental health aspects for families and loved ones involved?
I think Neil was talking about sort of the paradox of what we feel when this is happening. And I think to allow that paradox, that you don't have to go towards one or the other. You don't have to be relieved or sad or um, I just the whole process was absolutely profound, beautiful, meaningful, and really sad, filled with grief. It was all of that. And that it can be all of that. We don't have to choose one of those things. We can just let all those things be there.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for being here for this conversation. It's been something. You've been listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Dr. Lisa Segnitz, Chaplain Neil Vargas-Gladen, and Kim Stokely. And thanks to you for joining us. To learn more, check out the wealth of information included on the resource list in the show notes for this episode. If you found today's show interesting, you may also want to check out episode 68 on caring for aging and dying parents, episode 48 on aging with HIV, or other episodes that can be found in the Browse by Category section of our webpage under the Senior and Caregiver Support tab. New episodes of State of Mind, exploring mental health and wellness, are released the first Sunday of every month and can be found along with our complete archive on our website at www.stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of this episode or you just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you do help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you like this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Yusuf Hassanain for audio production and volunteer coordination, VJ Luca for audio production, Patrice Vecchioni for In Your Voice story coaching, Rantin Hui and Ronnie Wong for transcriptions, Priscilla Yi for graphic design, Nimilan Elachovin for marketing, and Heather Franks and Katrina Tattenham for research. And a special thank you to Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. We always want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. You can submit your very own In Your Voice recording and become part of the conversation by either calling in to leave a message or recording an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that's been helpful for you. We really do want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. Submission details can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.